Friends, let us try to take further the discussion on the peasant movement in India, and I think we had tried to cover up certain peasant movements that we tried to initiate earlier. We had spoken about the Tebhaga movement, we have spoken about the Telangana movement. I think both of them were in the different areas. Basically, we try to speak about that Telangana, which was basically in the Hyderabad region, and we try to see Tebhaga, which was in Bengal. So, I think we had tried to cover up the different movements which has been there at different period of time, and most of the movements have been at the various phases of development. We try to see that what were the various undercurrents, what was the social setting which has been there. We also try to see that what are the conditions which has made the movement to germinate, and also we have seen that what are the circumstances which has made the movement to come to a specific shape, and then we have also tried to find out through the various studies that what had led to the decline of the movement. I think friends, when we try to speak about any movement, we try to see that any movement can be seen into various phases. Like first of course is the phase of emergence, which we try to see that how it starts, and that way if you try to see every movement has a specific beginning. Then it has the phase of expansion, which we try to see in terms of its intensity, and then we try to see that every movement have its decline, which is seen as the downfall of the movement. So, I think any movement whatever we try to see, either it is the Telangana or Tebhaga, we try to see that what has made the movement to come into picture and what has led to the decline. So, in the similar lines, now we are going to take up another important movement as a case study, and this is basically chapter 9th, which is focusing upon the specific movement, which is the Mofla rebellion. So, we are basically dealing with the Mofla rebellion, which is seen as a specific movement which tries to uncover another debate about the various peasant movements that we had. We will try to see that in this Mofla movement, which is basically concentrating around the Malabar area, it will try to explain the Malabar agricultural system and the role of British administrators, and also we try to see that the Muslim invasion of the Malabar has led to the widespread atrocities on the Hindu population. So, here also we try to see that it is basically the movement which involves the Hindu and the Muslim population. A new system of land revenue was on the basis of the actual produce from the land. Thus, in 1921, the aim of this movement was basically against the Janmi system and to establish an Islamic nation in Malabar. The British administrators has referred to it as an outbreak, as an Mofla outrage, and this particular unit 9th is basically expressing the genesis, social conditions and outcome of the Mofla rebellion. So, friends, let us try to see that what has made the movement to creep up, what were the conditionality which has made the things more ripe, and then also we try to see that what has led to the downfall of this movement. So, basically our concern will be more towards the changing social structure, which is basically making the movement to come into shape. We will try to speak about the revolt by Mofla peasantry. That is going to be an important issue, because that virtually has led to the sharpening of the movement, and then we will try to see as the decline of the movement in terms of the downfall of the Mofla movement. I think these are important things that we have to see, and the main thrust of this unit is basically in identifying the changing agrarian structure of Malabar, and we also have to see the revolt which has been done by the Mofla peasantry, and we try to also identify what is the possible outcome of this movement. That is going to be an important issue. So, to begin with, let us try to speak about in detail what is the background that has made the Mofla to come up into a specific shape. The Moflas of Malabar in the southern India presents a fascinating case study. A series of Mofla uprising against both the Hindus, landlords and the British occurred throughout the 19th century and culminating finally in the greatest sustained armed revolt to break out in Malabar in the first quarter of the century. The chapter focuses mainly on the interaction of agrarian, religious and the political development and the Mofla response to them between the period of 1835 to 1921. I think this is the timeline in which we can locate the Mofla in terms of its intensity in order to explain the social structure and those changes within which we try to see the Mofla rebellion which has come into prominence. I think this period speaks about the range of activities which has been undertaken in the Mofla rebellion. Nowhere in India having the foreign trading, the commercial and the religious interests interacted within the indigenous socio-economic and the political institutions than that have been in Malabar. So, I think somewhere there was a uniqueness of Malabar in terms of having the foreign trading and also we have the commercial and the religious interest, both of them were there. The history of the Arab trading context with the Malayali society dates back to the 9th century. The local Hindu chieftains in this coastal region needed the support of the wealthy and enterprising Arab traders and hence granted them the liberal concession in their trade and business. Subsequently, those Arab traders who settled in Malabar married the local women, mostly the Nayars and Tiyars or Tiyans, and their descendants were basically the mixed race which were called as the Mofla or Mapilas. And from here only we try to see that the nomenclature of Mofla has come into existence. Thereafter, the Mofla population increased steadily and we try to see that the traders has purchased the large number of children from the lower caste Hindus and other subordinate groups in order to man their naves, a practice not only permitted but openly enjoyed by Zamorians Rajas in Malabar. Occasionally, those Tiyars women who violated the rigid sexual taboos were sold to the Moflas for whom each new proselytization was a welcoming addition despite the fact that upper caste Hindus treated them as the outcast. So, I think somewhere we try to see that the movement has a social bearing in terms of the conversion, religious conversion which was been quite visible. Now, let us try to see that what is the social structure which was prevailing and how it has changed through time. So, what is the social structure? Let us try to understand that conversion which was opened up as an avenue of social mobility for the Cherumars who being at the bottom of the social hierarchy in the Malabar and being attached to the land as a slave labor had suffered the oppression from the powerful land owning caste, particularly the Namudri Brahmins for the centuries. So, it is basically the sort of atrocities which has been created by the Namudri Brahmins against the lower caste who were acting as the slaves, that is the Cherumars, and the Cherumar slaves were sold, mortgaged or hired along with the land. So, by conversion to Islam they could not only free themselves from the bondages, but also rise in the social scale without any reprisal from the caste Hindu population. So, I think somewhere we try to see that religious conversion was seen as a site of emancipation for the lower caste Hindus, and they wanted, by converting into Islam, they were basically trying to be move away from the caste Hindu population in terms of the atrocity which has been created historically. So, as converts they merited both the sympathy and protection of the well organized Moflas whose ranks they joined. So, the conversion into Moflas was seen as a sort of a motivation and also a sort of an encouragement because that was seen as the way out for moving away from the atrocities which has been faced by these people through history. So, the forced conversion was practically unknown before the arrival of the Mysorean conqueror, and proselytizing in general seems to have progressed through the economic incentives and persuasion. The Arab monopoly of the trade and their political influence were both endangered when the Portuguese arrived in Malabar at the end of the 15th century. So, till 9th century we try to see that Arab monopoly has been there, but later on we try to see that Portuguese has arrived. Later on the Dutch, English and the French also joined the contest for supremacy in the Malabar export trade. The historical details of their mercantiles and power rivalry are documented elsewhere and need to be repeated here also. In the coastal towns, the Moflas were actually usually employed as petty traders and merchants, but a large proportion of those in the interior had taken to agriculture. They also emulated the martial marital traditions of Nayars and acquired a reputation as warriors. So, we try to see that they were also seen as the warriors. Most of the Moflas, however, lived in the areas governed by the Hindu chieftains. The Arikal Raja of Kannur was the only Muslim chieftain who had a political power to reckon with the northern Malabar. His troops consisted mostly of the Moflas. Occasionally, the Moflas were recruited as soldiers by the French and the English as well as, but this was in no sense a political alignment. It was not until the Hyder Ali, the Mysore ruler, who invaded Malabar in the 1760 that the Mofla aligned themselves politically with an external power. But before that, it was basically seen as a apolitical activity. During these invasions, the Namudri Brahmins fled in fear and sought asylum in the state of Travancore, where the ruler were Kshatriyas, that is the warrior caste Hindus, and while the Nayar chieftains either followed the suit or surrendered to the conqueror or took refuge in the jungles to continue the struggle. Those who attempted to resist and recapture their territories were brutally suppressed by Mysoreans. So, in the first decade of the British rule in Malabar, one of the questions that caused the new authorities anxiety concerned the land owning rights of the different classes. The Nayars and the Namudris were now returning and re-establishing themselves, but during their absence many Moflas had taken possession of the land and they had previously held with them. The new government has a difficult time reconciling the conflict claims to the land of Nayars and Moflas. So, somewhere we try to see that this situation of ambiguity over the control over the land was seen as a conditionality of discontent, and particularly in checking the widespread of the Mofla banditry. The customary land rights of various classes has been disturbed during the short-lived Mysorean rule, and the British administrators attempted to restore them in the course of their first land settlement. Therefore, the way that the British understood the various different kinds of land tenure and defined and enforced them should provide us with certain clue as to the cause of Mofla rising that occurred throughout the 19th century, culminating in the rebellion of 1921. So, virtually we try to see that a certain amount of issues with regard to the land tenure in terms of the control over the land, that was one of the burning issue which has basically led to the Mofla uprising, and that is why we are trying to consider it as a form of a peasant revolt. In the Malabar, the economic hierarchy of rights correspond perfectly with the several tied social structure, like we have Namudri Brahmins at the top and Cherumars, Pulayas and Parayas as at the bottom of the ladder. Although the exact nature of the Namudri superior rights in land was rather unclear until the first British settlement, it is nevertheless true that members of the priestly caste had held large estate for centuries. The ancient land tenure system in Malabar was somewhat similar to the feudal system of tenures in the medieval Europe. The ruling king made grants of land to Namudri Brahmins for the management of temples and other institutions they looked after, and also the Rajas and the chieftains who were basically the Nayars and who had a military obligations to the king to protect his territory with their retainers. So, the fundamental idea in the Malabar land system thus seemed to be protection and supervision rather than ownership in the sense of modern use. So, those who held land, they were basically called as the Janmis, that is those having the birthright. Let it out to others for cultivation, retaining only a small portion as the personal farm to be cultivated by the bonded slaves. So, the land grants were hereditary and implied the customary sharing of the produce between the Janmis and those other classes below him, which included the Kanamdars or Kanakaran, the Verupattam and the agricultural labourers. So, the Kanam was a tenure whereby the tenant offered a sum to a Janmi either as a security or as an advance rent in return for the land leased out for a specified period. This was more or less the equivalent as mortgaging the land. Now, Kanamdars either sublet the land to the Verupattamdars for the actual cultivators or hired labourers, or to cultivate it under their own management. Only a few of them cultivated land with family labour. So, most of the Kanamdars came from the educated middle class and held the bureaucratic positions. Having invested the money in securing Kanam tenure, their mortgages has come to occupy the middleman position in the agrarian social structure. So, they were basically acting as the middleman with regard to the land system. It was during the Mysorean invasion that the agrarian structure of Malabar has disturbed for the first time. The Mysorean rule introduced a land tax which encroached on the customary share of Janmis and the Kanamdars, but left the share of Virumdars who were basically the actual cultivators intact. Since many Brahmins and Nayars had fled and lands were actually in the possessions of Kanamdars, now mostly was with the Moflas. Therefore, in all probability it was the Mofla Kanamdars and that the Mysore revenue officials made through the first settlement. Those who rebelled or resisted were hanged. In this respect, as has already been mentioned, the Mysorean did not spare even the co-religious also. So, after taking control of Malabar in 1792, the British government appointed a joint commission to inquire into the nature of Malabar land tenure, because the land tenure system has been disrupted or sometimes the ambiguity has been there. So, the commission began its work in the midst of the near hierarchy. The Brahmins and the Nayars who had fled were now returning and trying to reinstate themselves under the British protection. The claims and the counterclaims regarding the control of land has created a chaotic situation, while the religious persecution by the Mysorean has totally upset the hitherto friendly relation between the Brahmins, the Nayars and the Moflas. It was therefore the urgent need to settle the land questions in Malabar that drove the first joint commissioner to recognize the Janmis rather harshly as an absolute proprietary rights in the land, and to declare the Kanamdars and Verupattamdars the tenants of the Janmis. It was basically seen as the leaseholders liable to be evicted at expiry of the lease. So, to a degree, the British recognition of the Janmis right as an absolute proprietary right may be seen as a part of general tendency to relate the kind of property rights with which the English administrators were familiar at home. Secondly, the commissioner used the system of land settlement in Mysore as their point of reference, with the result that the revenue rates they fixed were very high. In 1800, for example, the revenue burden amounts to 35 to 40% of the gross produce. Thirdly, the government relied on the recently restored Hindu Rajas and the chieftains for the collection of revenue, and this resulted in unequal assessment. Mofla cultivators being rated more heavily than the Hindus. This occasioned the several outbreak of violence between the Moflas and Nayars, which were suppressed by the Britishers. So, it is important to note that the recognition of Janmi as an absolute owner or the lord of soil formed the lasting basis of the British land policy in Malabar, and throughout the 19th century the British administrative and the judicial institutions thus worked directly to restore the landed aristocracy of the Namudri, Janmis and Nayars. So, we try to find out that the preservation of class of landlord was vital to the British policy of securing the allies, although they professed the aim of the policy of restoration, which was been stated to be attainment of the highest objective of the good government and the future improvement of the people. Corruption was rife in the ranks of the revenue staff, who made a common cause with the landlords, tempered with the deeds and contract, so as to be best serve the landlord's interest, and by such means also made their own fortunes. With newly established law codes, Janmis were able to extort more renewal fees and rent from the leaseholders, whom they simply threatened with legal evictions if they were refused to pay. By such means, each superior right holders could extract a large share than previously from the one immediately below him in the chain of sub-unification, and the worst sufferers of all were the Verupattamdars and the landless labourers, whether the Mofla or the Hindus. Now, let us try to see the Mofla rebellion, which actually took place in Malabar in 1921, and I think that may be the grounding through which we can really understand that how or what has made the Mofla rebellion to happen in a specific fashion. The Mofla peasant movement was engineered in August 1921 among the peasants of Malabar district in Kerala. The first important thing is that the Mofla tenants were Muslims, and they initiated against the Hindu landlord and the British government. So, it was basically a tussle between the religion, between the Hindus and the Muslims. Their grievances were related to the lack of any security of tenure, renewal fees, high rent and other oppressive landlord exaction. In the 19th century as well, there has been the case of Mofla resistance to landlord's oppression, but what erupted in 1921 was a different scale altogether. Actually, the freedom movement covered a span of long decade beginning from 1835 to 1947. The social and the economic background of the Mofla has been quite heterogeneous. The elites among the Moflas earned their livelihood by working as a petty traders and merchants. However, the masses of Mofla earned their livelihood by working as small agriculturists. They were the tenants of the big landlords, who happened to be the high caste Hindus. Though the Moflas were poor, they imitated the traditional ways of Nayars and acquired the reputation of warriors. There was British ruler in Malabar. The officials, in collaboration with Hindu landlords, exploited the Moflas and oppressed them to the greater length. So, we try to say that the Mofla agitation of 1921 was preceded by several movements between 1835 to 1921, and D. N. Dhanagre has elaborated the series of Mofla movement which took place before the major Mofla movement of 1921. He traces the history of Mofla movement according to the important sources. He says that significantly, as soon as the Janmi landlords, backed by the police, the law courts and the revenue officials, tightened their grips on the subordinate classes, the Mofla peasantry in its turn started to revolt against the oppressors. The first such outbreak occurred in 1836, and thereafter between 1836 to 1854, that 22 similar uprisings has occurred, of which in 1841 and another in 1849 were quite serious. In general, the outbreak followed a similar patterns of understanding. Almost invariably, it involves a group of Mofla youths attacking a Brahmin Janmis and a Nayar officials or Janmi servants. Sometimes it also involved the burning or defilement of the temples, and occasionally the burning or looting of the landlord's house. So, I think the violence also was involved in terms of destruction of the properties which has been seen, We also try to find out that it was basically having a religious color also. Many rebels had some sort of family titles with the leader Athan Kurikal, whose ancestors were associated with the past Mofla rebellion. Athan was angry about the way the large number of evictions done by Hindu landlord and deprived the Mofla peasant, and the way the government encroached the inams ya waqfs, that is the tax free land, and thus the Manjari revolt was stemmed as a sheer fanatism which was having a religious beliefs. Later on in 1852, the government of Madras appointed a commissioner to inquire into the case of Mofla disturbance, but they also favored the Hindu landlords, and after this the deadline were fixed for Mofla to surrender the arms. In 1855, the Connolly, who was the DM of Malabar, he was having a tragic death, and which led to the further intensification of the repression. His killers were captured and publicly hanged. The bodies were burned instead of burying them as per the Islamic practices, and the ashes of these people were collected and buried within the walls of the jail. So, I think somewhere we try to see that it is a sort of intensification of the terror, that if someone who is trying to go against the law will be treated very harshly, and to an extent that even they will not be allowed to be having the death as per the religious practices, as we have seen the case. So, the Mofla community has to adopt the new conditions of repression. The formulation of the new role of mosque and madrasa has been there. Proselytization to strengthen the Mofla numbers was being carried forward, because they wanted to have more and more Moflas under them, so that they can have regain their strength which they earlier had. So, it reinforced the religious identity of Mofla, but could not change their material conditions, because if you try to see the economic prosperity of Mofla, it has gradually declined, and we try to see that the attempts for enhancement of the number or certain initiative which has been taken up by Athan Kurikal followers, they could not bring back the glory of the Moflas. In 1875, the government has appointed William Logan as the DM of Malabar. I think this is where we have to see that how we try to speak about that Moflas which were basically trying to have an important understanding, and in 1885 his committee accelerated the tenure system, and this has led to the further rebellion in 1896 killing the Hindu landlords. I think if we have to speak about these particular issues, we try to find out that the sort of Mofla rebellion was basically seen as an outcome of certain religious what you can say color. Especially we try to see that initially there was some favor which was been given to the so called what you can say the past inheritors of the land. Especially we try to speak about the Moflas who had been safeguarded by basically the initial rule, but when we try to see the support of British, we try to find out that the Britishers they sometimes try to support the Hindu landlords, and that is where we try to see that there was a certain amount of distress which has been there, and virtually we try to see that these religious colors has basically shaped the sort of Mofla rebellion. We try to see that many arrangements have been made, especially we try to speak about that how we have many different shades which has been given. We try to speak about how the different higher caste populations which were basically the Hindu population who were basically seen as the Namudri Brahmins, they had the supremacy, and the Cherumars who were basically the lower caste Hindus, they were being exploited in the old arrangements, and how the Cherumars were being motivated to switch off from the Hindu religion to the Muslim religion in terms of having certain amount of escape from the atrocities which they were facing. So, virtually we try to find out that these Charimars, when they were converted into Islam, and we try to see that they form the part and parcel of the Mofla, and these Moflas which were basically having a certain amount of what you can say benefits when the Arab monopoly was there. So, during the Arabic time, when the Arabs were having the monopoly in terms of trade and political influence, they were basically having the upper hand, and Moflas were being blindly supported. Even the proselytizations, the religious conversions have been there, which has been safeguarded by the Arabs, and the all possibilities of the favors were being given to the Muslim population, and even the land were being granted to them in terms of the benefits. And we try to see that during this particular period there was bad arrangements which has been made for the Hindu rulers. Basically even the control over the land was being taken away, and it was been basically given to the Moflas. But the things have changed when we try to see that the advent of the other what you can say trading institutions have come into the picture, especially the advent of Portuguese in Malabar, and then we have the Dutch and the English who has gradually joined. And also we try to see that the sort of an arrangements which have been perpetuating in the Malabar region and how the Moflas were basically been benefited. And we try to see that the Nayars who were been having a good reputation in terms of the martial traditions, they were not basically given the upper hand in terms of a support. But virtually we try to see that as the British rule in the Malabar has come into prominence, the Nayars and the Namudris, they were started returning and re-establishing themselves. And during this initial period when the Moflas were given the upper hand, I think most of the land rights were given to them directly or indirectly. And once the British rule has came in Malabar, they try to really try to restructure the land arrangements, and through the various committees they try to set up certain arrangements whereby the Hindu chieftains, that is the Nayars and the Namudris, they could gain the benefits which they had retained earlier. And the Moflas who had the possession of the lands, who had previously having the control over the lands under the Arab rulers, now it has to be taken over, and now it has to be given to the Nayars. And even we try to see that certain amount of Mofla banditry also has been promoted, and the customary land rights of various classes has been disturbed when the Mysore rule has been advented. So, during the Mysore rule, I think certain amount of land grab initiatives have been taken up, and Mofla banditry were trying to capture the lands of the Hindu chieftains, basically the Nayars. But however, when the things have changed back again, and we try to see that again when there is an advent of the British rule, we try to speak about that the arrangements have been restructured again. The ruling king made grants to the land to the Namudri Brahmins for the management of temples, and the Raja and the chieftains, mostly the Nayars, they had been given the military obligations to the king to protect the territory. So, I think it is again what you can say, trying to see the sort of churning which has taken place. So, it is the whole movement has to be seen in terms of having wave arrangements, whereby there is rise of the Moflas, and then there is a downfall of the Moflas in terms of their control over the land. Similarly, when we try to speak about the Hindu chieftains, especially the Nayars and Namudri Brahmins, we try to see that Namudri Brahmins and the Nayars, they had a well-off positions initially, and gradually through time it has declined, and again they try to revive. So, I think lots of ups and downs are there, but ultimately because of these what you can say initiatives which have been there either at the end of the Arab traders or the British traders in that sense, and also with the gradual advent of the in between rule, by the Tipu Sultan. We try to see that certain amount of arrangement has been distorted, especially the control and the land rights, they have been highly disturbed. And we can say that because of these things, what has happened of course is that lot many atrocities has taken place. Even the communal relationships which has been there between the Hindus and the Muslims, that has been sharpened, and it has also led to certain amount of banditries which has been done by the Moflas, who tried to grab the land of the upper caste Hindus, and that is where we try to see that whole disturbance has taken place. We also try to see that the lands which were basically given to the Jainis, who has been seen as having the real control over the lands. So, the Jaini who were basically called as having the land by birthright, now they had to change the color, and we try to see that the sort of containment of the cultivation rights in terms of small portion of land. So, the Jainis who were seen as the important class in terms of people who are basically the Kanamdars and the Verupattamdars, and also we have the agricultural laborers. So, the tenure system, basically the Jaini relations in that sense has been disturbed, and Kanams was a tenure whereby the tenants offered a sum to the Jaini. So, I think somewhere we try to see that the arrangements which have been there between the different caste groups also has changed, and we try to see that the issue of Kanamdars in terms of giving certain land to the Verumpatadars for actual cultivation in terms of hired laborers to cultivate their own management. So, I think these are the arrangements which have been there, although they were not the permanent structures, but we try to see that it has basically led to certain amount of distortion and the sort of exploitation which has been there. And especially when we try to see that during the Mysore invasion, how the agrarian structure of the Malabar has been disturbed. Basically we try to see that the customary shares of the Jainis and the Kanamdars, that was basically been disturbed, and we try to see that the Brahmins and Nayars, virtually they have to leave the land, and the lands were actually in the possessions of the Kanamdars, who were basically the cultivators, and most of them were the Moflas. So, virtually the land rights were given to the Moflas back. So, I think these sort of rivalries which has been there historically, either it is the British invasion or it is the Mysore invasion, or it is sometimes seen as the Arab invasions, all these things has led to the whole distortion of the agrarian relations. And we try to see that suddenly the people who have been the landlords has to just give off their land, and those who are basically having the control over the land in terms of cultivations, they have become the real landlords, and gradually when the things have changed, so the landlord has becomes back to the tenancy in terms of the tenants of that land. So, I think these arrangements were making the things more different, and various arrangements has been made by the various ruler, especially the British government, who tried to bring back the glory of putting the Malabar land tenure straight. I think and for that they have appointed the various commissions, and somewhere the British government had tried to favor the Hindu landlords, Hindu chieftains who are basically serving their armies, and that is how they tried to give back certain amount of control to the Brahmins and the Nayars who had fled away. So, we try to see that these supports or these arrangements have somewhere led to certain amount of changes within the existing structure, and ultimately we try to see that Mofla rebellion has to be seen in terms of certain amount of outburst which is coming out because the so called ruler has been thrown off or has been changed, and then suddenly there is certain amount of land grabs which has been there by sometimes the Hindu chieftains, or sometimes it has been done by the Moflas, but on all possibilities and probabilities it is found that the sort of recognition of Jainis as an absolute owner, as the lord of the soil at certain period of time during the British land policy, that has happened, and all favors were given to the Hindu landlords. But at the same times we also find out that the Moflas has also had the high level of motivation for acquiring the land. So, virtually we try to see that these arrangements had made the things more chaotic, and that is how we try to see a shift which has taken place. I think when we try to see the Mofla rebellion which started in 1921 and how it has spread in the Malabar districts in Kerala, that has gained the attention of many historians and social scientists. Basically we try to see that it was basically the Muslims who had agitated against the Hindu landlords and the British government. So, this Mofla rebellion is basically seen as the Muslim landlords who were basically fighting against the Hindu landlords and the British government who were tied together. And this is where we try to see that the land lack of any security of tenure, I think that was one important issue, and then the high rents and the oppressive landlord execution, I think were certain important issues which Mofla resistance was trying to overcome. And in order to do that, I think somewhere the initiatives have been there which has taken the shape of violence, including the burning of the houses of the landlords, or sometimes even trying to disturb the religious institutions of the upper caste Hindus, and that is how we try to see that the things have been shifted. And we try to find out that somewhere we have the bearing of a certain amount of the previous rulers like Athan Kurikal, who has played a prominent role with regard to bringing the Mofla rebellion into the picture. And we try to see that how the British governments, they try to support the Hindu landlords and deprive the Mofla peasants. So, that has been highly questioned by the followers of Athan Kurikal, and we try to see that when there was Lord Colonelly, who was the DM of Malabar, has been has a tragic death, virtually has led to certain amount of intensification of what you can say the disturbances between the Mofla Muslim rulers and the and also the Hindu chieftains. And I think this is where we try to see, even when the William Logan as the DM of Malabar, he was trying to make certain reforms in terms of bringing about some favor to the Hindu landlords, but the rebellion was gone to such an extent that many Hindu landlords were being killed by the Moflas, and that is what made this movement more violent. So, virtually we try to see that the so called what you can say effect which we can see after the killing of William Logan, not the killing of the Hindu landlords, has been seen, and ultimately there is a gross neglect of the tenurial security, and the deterioration of the landlord tenant relationships has been there, and there is also the political alienation of poor peasantry, which were basically seen as a condition of the outbreak of the 1921 Mofla rebellion. Along with this were the tenancy movement and also the Khilafat and the non-cooperation movement of the Indian National Congress, and that is where we try to see that this movement has been having certain amount of prominence at the national map, because it has its association with the Khilafat movement, and somewhere it has been having certain support from the Indian National Congress. The epicenter of the Mofla rebellion in terms of a tenancy movement was in Calicut, and the Kanamdars who boycotted the landlord by refusing to give the rent which is expected from the land. The first Malabar Tenant Association was formed in 1916. So, basically we try to see that it was a hardcore resistance which has been registered by the tenant. They had formed a tenant association, and between 1916 to 1920 we try to see that the leaders of the Kanamdar tenant capture the control over the Malabar Congress. So, I think somewhere we try to see that there is certain intervention of the political affairs also, and we try to see even the national leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, Shaukat Ali, Maulana Azad, they have also visited the Malabar to promote the campaign. So, virtually we try to see that the Kanamdar tenants had shown the high range of what I can say change, especially they could bring back the sort of a policy whereby the tenancy movement has become national, and we try to see that between 1916 to 1920 the leader has the Kanamdar tenants has basically tried to give a new color to this Mofla rebellion. And in April 1921 the Majlis ul Ulema, that is the national Muslim organizations, in conference at Erode had called upon the Mofla masses to launch a jihad. So, I think this is where we try to see that Mofla masses are trying to give a new color to the movement in terms of a religious movement, and they wanted to launch it is in terms of a jihad. And however, we try to see that by the end of the December 1923, the Mofla rebellion has been completely suppressed, and I think there are many reasons for that. We basically try to see that the national character of this movement to some extent also has the downfall, like the Khilafat movement which has been quite vibrant, but somewhere Mahatma Gandhi also thought of that this Khilafat movement if it goes higher, then sometimes the communal color can also be given at the national level, and so the Khilafat movement has not been taken up very seriously and was not been promoted at the national level. So, the same issue has happened here, whereby the Mofla who had been supported by the Khilafat movement, but gradually we try to see a gradual decline. It is basically the shrinking of, or sometimes we try to find out that the National Congress also did not initially they supported the Mofla rebellion, but gradually they try to indirectly withdraw the support, because they try to feel that it is going to be having the communal appeal, and that is how we try to see that there is a gradual decline which has happened with regard to the Mofla rebellion. And we can say that the Mofla movement of 1921 was altogether different. First, it has erupted among the Muslim peasants against the Hindu landlord. So, that was the first stage that we try to see, and then secondly we try to see it was characterized by certain amount of violence. Basically, it involves the killings of the Hindu landlords. Sometimes it is been seen as capturing or destroying the properties of the Hindu chieftains. So, certain amount of violence was involved, and Gandhi, as the promoter of non-violence, did not wanted that it should happen. And thirdly, the movement, as the history goes, fell into the trap of the Hindu-Muslim riots, and I think this is where we try to see that any movement, if it is trying to have the Hindu-Muslim riot, so the appeal for the landlordism or the land rights in terms of the land reforms or in terms of bringing about the tenancy reforms, they are going to be away, because nobody will try to support if something is going on the communal lines. And during this period, the Khilafat movement, as I shared, is a movement that raised from the attainment of freedom for the Muslims. And I think when we try to see that Khilafat movement showed much emphasis towards this movement, the National Congress tried to withdraw gradually, and this is where we try to see the downfall of the Mofla rebellion had started. Some of the important causes of Mofla peasant movements which we can narrate are, basically we try to see that any analysis of the peasant movement of Mofla should take into account that the Moflas were Muslim peasants. Their landlords were called the Janmis, who were basically the Hindus, and the relations of between the Janmis and the Moflas were historically quite unfriendly. In other words, the relations were both economically and religiously antagonistic, and in 1835 the Hindu landlords suppressed the Mofla tenants. So, we try to see that the basic cause of Mofla agitation was oppression against the Janmis. So, it was basically the Janmis, the relationship between the Janmis and the Moflas, which was going to be very important cause for bringing about the Mofla rebellion. Another important issue is that the land tenure system in Malabar was quite unfavorable to the Mofla tenants. As we have said that the Mofla tenancy has been fluctuating according to the rule, and sometimes we try to see that during Arab time, Arab rule, it was very ripe, but when we try to see during the British rule, suddenly there was a sharp decline. So, we try to see that there are different shades of Mofla tenancy which has happened. There was a total insecurity of the tenure to the Moflas, if you say, and they could be ejected from their land without any appropriate notice. So, I think these are certain things which has happened. Then we also try to see that the immediate cause of Mofla agitation was the renewal of the fees at the exorbitant rate fixed by the Janmis, and this was unbearable for the Moflas. In a true sense, we try to see that execution practiced by the Janmis were of very high order, and more often we try to see that Moflas were discriminated against the Hindu tenants. So, there are two different things which go simultaneously. We try to see that the land relations which has not been having a specific subject, sometimes there is a fluctuation with regard to the ownership, and we try to see that the Hindu tenants have been treated differently. However, the Muslim tenants have been treated differently. So, I think these are certain things which has created more unrest with regard to the movement, and the course of event that has led to the Mofla movement can be seen in a specific sense, that the first impetus of the Mofla resistance which is started against the landlord, it has came from the Malabar District Congress Committee, which was held at Majeri in April 1920. And we try to see that this conference supported the tenants cause and demanded the legislation to regulate the landlord tenant relationships. And we also try to see following the Majeri conference of 1920 that the Mofla tenants formed an association which had its branches in the whole of Kerala, and this has brought the Mofla tenants under one organization. So, we try to find out that the motivating factors for the 1921 Mofla agitation was also the Khilafat movement, which has constituted a wider part of national struggle for independence, and this movement developed its roots in Malabar also. So, the Moflas has took an active part in the Khilafat movement at the national level. Actually, in practice, the meeting of Moflas and the Khilafat could have hardly be separated. So, we can see that there were certain protection and support which has been there from the leadership of Khilafat movement to the Mofla movement, and the bonds between the Khilafat movement and the Mofla tenants became so much mixed that the government issued prohibitory notices on all Khilafat meetings on the 5th February 1921, and this has displeased the Moflas and ended up with the agitation of the Mofla peasantry. So, somewhere we try to see that Mofla peasantry whose concern was not only for the land rights, but their concern was also to have an upper hand for the Muslim peasantry. That was another important thing which was coming up, and we try to see that this has basically mismatched certain amount of relationship between the two units. We also try to see that the British government was weakened with the result of the First World War, and it was not in a position to take strong military action against the Moflas, and we try to see that Moflas began to exhibit increasingly signs of turbulence and defiance of authority. The final break came when the district magistrate of Arnad Taluka on August 1921 has raided the mosque of Turanga Gadi to arrest Ali Musailer. Was a Khilafat leader, and he was highly respected priest in that mosque, and the people were quite peaceful, but the police has opened the fire on the unarmed crowd, and this has led to a lot of killing, and a clash ensured that government offices were destroyed, the records were burned, and the treasury was looted. So, the rebellion soon spread into the Ernad, Veluvanad and Punani talukas, and all these were the important Mofla's stronghold in terms of population and in terms of their political setting. We also try to see that the agitations were targeted, which has been targeted by the Mofla attacks, were the unpopular Jainis. They were basically the Hindus, police stations, treasuries and the offices, and the British planters. The Hindu landlords who were lenient to the relations with the Moflas were spared by the latter. It is also been seen, interestingly, the Mofla rebels travelled several miles through the territory populated by the Hindus and attacked only the landlords. So, this has given a communal flavor to the peasant agitation, and as a matter of fact, the Malabar people in general lost all the sympathy with the Moflas. Especially we try to see the communalization of the peasant agitation was suicidal to the Mofla. So, commenting on this new aspect of Mofla agitation, the historian Vipin Chandra has said that the communalization of the rebellion completed the isolation of Moflas from the nation and from the region. The British repression did not rest, and by December 1921 all the resistance has come to a stop. So, the toll was heavy, that around 2,337 Moflas have lost their lives. Unofficial estimate place the number of above 10,000, and around 45,400 rebels were captured or they have to surrender, but the toll was in fact even higher or heavier. We try to see that the Moflas were so completely crushed and demoralized that till independence their participation in any form of politics was almost nil. So, the movement of Mofla is a failure story. Much of it has to be defeated in terms of the communal thing. Importantly, it is to be seen that Khilafat movement stood for non-violence and also a struggle for independence. So, the Mofla took it to violence and a method of agitation. So, I think on principle they were very different, and also we try to see that the movement did not motivate the peasantry of the neighborhood to stand in arm against the landlords, because it has a communal angle. So, it was perhaps the lone tragedy of Moflas that their landlords happened to be Hindus, and this was never a case in any of the agitation which took place during the 1920s and earlier. So, to conclude, we can say that the peasant movement which took place in the 19th and the 20th centuries were part of the wider national struggle. On the one hand, these movements were influenced by the freedom struggle, and on the other hand, their impact on the struggle was also important. And we try to see that how the peasant movement which took place either at the transitional period which ended with the freedom struggle and attainment of the freedom struggle, and ultimately we try to see that the analysis of this peasant movement is going to be quite crucial. There were several causes of these movements, the major being the increase in the land tax, security of tenure and exploitation of the poor peasantry by the landlords, but the big and the middle peasants also participated in the movement, and most of the movements, leaving aside the Moflas, were characterized by the non-violence. However, in the Mofla we try to see that violence was involved, and that is how we try to see that there is a sharp decline, and the Mofla rebellion has ended completely. So, friends, I think this is where we have to learn, take a lesson from this particular discussion that we had, that how Mofla rebellion has taken an ugly shape and resulted into the sharp decline. And I think plenty of material is available for further readings. We can have the contribution by D.N. Dhanagre, that is on peasant movement in India, that one has to see, and apart from that we have the contribution by A.R. Desai on agrarian struggle in India after independence, that is in 1986, we have to see for further learnings. So, with that friends, we are going to end up these discussions, and we will try to have further interaction in the coming future. Thank you for the patience listenings, and enjoy your day. Thank you.